Here in the mountains we have more distinct seasons than on the coast, and as they keep rolling by, I always think that they echo the way I write books. When you're starting to think up a new story, it's like winter. Your mind's a blank, nothing's stirring, it's all barren ground in there. Then ideas start to germinate. It's like late winter in my garden when the bulbs sprout and the hellebore and the camellias bloom. And then spring for me is when I start to really formulate a story, planning and plotting, writing a synopsis, seeing colourful ideas spring to life in my head. Summer for me is the period of full-blown writing, when every idea is in bloom, and there's often a bit of drama and anxiety, as there is in the mountains during summer because of the bushfires. Then autumn is when I edit and clip and prune, and then when I lay the book to rest, winding it up, finishing it. And then the whole process starts again with the next book. It's the way my life is parcelled out. Every book is just like a year in the garden. I once wrote a romance novel about gardening called The Gentleman's Garden. The two main characters bonded over creating an English-style garden in early colonial Sydney. With gardens, you can't help getting metaphorical, especially since this particular garden was all about growing foreign plants in unfamiliar terrain. I had to use a lot of old-style gardening books for this novel. Books like Cassell's Household Guide, which was published in the 1860s but has a lot of gardening tips that would have been relevant for earlier on in the century. These old household guides also contain a lot of advice on other things like cooking and crochet and knitting, which still hold up. I love these guides. I love dipping into them. They're very pretty, domestic, and weirdly interesting. Some of the advice for women is a bit cringeworthy, especially when it comes to health or marriage or social conduct, but it's all very important for me to have when I'm researching my books. These novels are all set in the 18th and 19th century, so I had to find out as much as I could about servants and clothes and housework and cooking back in the day, which is why household guides were very useful. These were also really useful. These are two old magazines, the New St. Louis and the Old Homestead, which is full of really popular and interesting tips like the Mother's Corner and the Homestead Circle and everything about the house, and also fantastic ads with wonderful pictures. If you're wondering why I've got these old magazines in my desk, it's because I'm a complete history buff. I love to know the background of things. That's why I know that this house was built in the 1940s by a builder as his retirement home, and I think before he moved in or he built his house, it was actually part of a dairy, because I dug up an old cowbell in the garden and there's an old dairy not very far from here. The milk shed's still there. I mean, it's not a milk shed anymore, it's been converted, but you can still see the original doors. The farmhouse is just around the corner. I'm not sure exactly when it was built, or if it was built by a local entrepreneur called Charles Lindeman. I know Charles Lindeman did have a dairy around here, but it might have been the house where my friend is now living down the hill. Charles Lindeman was an important man in the Upper Mountains. He was also on the municipal council, and he was the postmaster at Lura Railway Station, and he helped to build the Ritz, which was then called the Lura Palace Hotel. The Ritz has actually survived, though it's closed right now. It opened in 1892, and Charles Lindeman transferred the post office facilities from Lura Station to this hotel, so he was obviously a bit of an operator. But he lost everything during the First World War. Every German in Australia suffered then because of the 1916 Naturalised Subjects Franchise Act, when Germans were effectively turned into second-class citizens. But I do know that before Charles Lindeman and the builder and our own family, this land belonged to the Gundungurra and Dargan people. And over the next valley, there's a waterfall that I know is very significant to Aboriginal women. I don't know the Indigenous stories of this place. I can't tell you why it's significant to Gundungurra and Dargan women, but there is a great sense of being embraced and nurtured here. I can actually walk home from the falls, mostly through bushland, and you can see the seasonal changes there too, sort of like the changes in my garden, but different. Here, winter isn't barren. It's quite the opposite. The broadleaf geebungs not only flower in winter, but also start fruiting. You can actually eat geebung fruit. It's bush food and tastes a bit like overripe watermelon, but apparently you have to wait until the fruit falls to the ground before it's ripe enough, and that happens in the spring. Narrow-leafed geebungs look a little different from broad-leafed ones, but they fruit at exactly the same time. I actually mentioned geebungs in my novel Traced, partly because I love them so much. They're beautiful looking and they have the most extraordinary bark which protects them from bushfires. The flaky exterior catches a light and insulates the rest of the trunk, which is the most beautiful deep crimson. Unfortunately, they're impossible to propagate. You just can't grow them from seed. Here's something else that fruits in winter, and I would love to know what it is. It looks a bit like a casuarina, but I have no idea really. If anyone knows, I'd like to find out. The bush is full of flowers in winter, but often they're very small. You really have to keep an eye out to see them. These nodding greenwood orchids are really small. They bloom between August and November. And these are bush food too. The tubers are usually edible. I don't have any nodding greenwood orchids in my garden, but I am very excited because I have one tiny little pink finger orchid, which I only noticed because it flowered. Otherwise, it's just one single leaf and it's so small that you'd miss it. I also discovered some native potato orchids growing in the garden out of the mulch near the azaleas. They're not flowering at the moment, but they will. Their time will roll around the way it does for everything. Meanwhile, I'll enjoy the rest of the flowers.